So this is an introduction to macroeconomics and unit 3.2. It's actually quite an important unit because it does introduce the sort of basic fundamentals of Keynesian and classical economics. It's also a little bit similar to just the microeconomics supply and demand analysis, but now we're just looking at an aggregate level. So we start off with this unit just looking at aggregate demand, aggregate supply curves, why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. You'll see that just a slight change in the way that we label the axes now. We've got price level and real GDP. Still, it's very similar to before, though, with microeconomics. Shifts to the right of aggregate demand is an increase, shifts to the left is a decrease. Here's the three reasons why an aggregate demand curve is thought to be downward sloping: the real income effect, the real balance effect, and the international substitution effect. Then you'll get into a lot of reasons why the aggregate demand curve might shift. They're really important now, because when we start looking at aggregate demand in detail and Keynes's C plus I plus G plus X minus M, essentially what we're looking at are reasons why consumption spending might change. Some of these could be influenced by the government, of course. Investment spending, here's a list of factors that can affect investment, government spending, and net exports or exports minus imports can also change. So any of these changes in aggregate demand can shift it to the right or the left. Aggregate supply is a little bit more complicated because we divide it up into short run and long run. There's not much disagreement on the short run, but there's fundamental disagreement on the long run aggregate supply curve. Short run is a period of time when the prices of resources are roughly constant or inflexible. In other words, wages don't change. This is a crucial one. Wages or the price of labour don't change very much. Short and aggregate supply curve, then, if wages are not changing very much, the reason why it's upward sloping, more will be supplied as the price goes up, because as the price goes up, firms can obviously sell for a higher price, but their costs don't increase when they produce more. So the profit motive will ensure that the short and aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, as it is there in that diagram. And again, we'll get lots of reasons why the short and aggregate supply curve might shift to the right or the left. And as with microeconomics, it's very much related to costs of production. So any of these changes in wages and other resources, business taxes, subsidies, and some supply shocks can shift the aggregate supply curve either to the right, that's an increase there, this way, and a decrease is that way there. So you're familiar with that. And then we've just basically got the short run aggregate supply aggregate demand model. And again, in a market, the expectation is we move to this equilibrium point just here. You can play around with these, depending on the question. In a very basic model, you're just looking at shifts to the right or the left, and you can show changes in the price level, inflation, changes in real GDP. It's really useful when you're talking about changes in real GDP, whether GDP's gone up or gone down. There's an implied impact on employment. So it's fine to say that, if real GDP increases from Y1 to Y2, we're producing a higher output. We can easily argue the case that therefore there'll be more people employed in order to increase that level of output. Introduces the notion of inflationary, deflationary gaps, again, really crucial in our analysis of macroeconomics. So this first diagram here is what's called a deflationary gap. Remember that business cycle diagram where you've got the actual output below the potential? That's here. That's the deflationary gap here, or recessionary gap. So the actual output here is below the potential here. All right. So, and then in an inflationary gap, we've got the actual output above the potential. Remember, that's possible because of the way that we define employment. The potential is at full employment, but full employment does not mean that everybody has got a job. There will still be people at the natural rate of unemployment who are not working. So you can increase your actual above that if you can tempt these people into the labour market, which you usually do with higher wages. Now, with the long run, we get into the whole neoclassical Keynesian debate. we need to understand that John Maynard Keynes, his view was the context was the 1920s, the 1930s, like the Great Recession. So he's looking at an economy through a lens of somebody who is living through a world depression. Classical economists, or the neoclassical economists, are very much free market economists. All right, so let's start with them. They believe that the system does not need any government intervention if it's operating in a perfectly competitive way. So they'll see a long run aggregate supply curve as being perfectly vertical. So you can recognize that a classical diagram has got a long run aggregate supply curve that's vertical at the potential output. So the economy always gravitates to the potential, that trend line on the business cycle, full employment, the natural rate of unemployment, whatever you want to call it. So you're not going to get any inflationary and deflationary gaps in the long run in a classical model. Now, if you look at this diagram here with point A to begin with, and then the economy goes into a recession, and we move to point B, the aggregate demand has fallen. For a classical economist, the unemployed resources that result from that will lead to a fall in costs. Wages in particular will come down, and a fall in costs will trigger an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve to SRAS2, and we move to point C. So the classical view is that we'll just have this movement back towards full employment as a sort of natural course of events. Similarly, with the inflationary gap, we start at A, demand has increased in the economy beyond where we're comfortable, prices start to rise, actual output is greater than the potential, that triggers an increase in costs, particularly wages, and we move back to point C. Right, so there's never going to be a situation where there's a sort of need for direct government intervention in the economy. That's very different to the Keynesian model, because for Keynes, Keynes came at it from two perspectives, really, very similar, very related. One is that, particularly in a recession, wages do not adjust to the market. So we're not going to see a decrease in wages when we're in a recessionary gap, a deflationary gap. And the second thing for Keynes is that Keynes was a believer that the demand had to come first. So demand is the trigger in the economy. If there's no demand, there's not going to be supply. And it's a bit different to the classical view, which is very much supply-led. That wages come down, costs fall, therefore businesses will increase their aggregate supply. Keynes said that's not going to happen. So we're not going to move to a long-run equilibrium. In fact, we can get stuck in a deflationary gap here at D. There's nothing that's naturally inherent in the economy to bring us out of this recession. Wages are not going to fall, costs are not going to come down, and entrepreneurs are not going to automatically just increase the supply in the economy. So unless the government does something directly to manipulate aggregate demand and have this shift here, we can get stuck at point D. So normally the Keynesian sort of long-run aggregate supply curve is drawn in this way. We have this flat section, which is often referred to as the Keynesian section. This upward sloping bit, which is the intermediate zone, and then this vertical bit is the sort of classical section of the Keynesian long-run aggregate supply curve. I mean, when Keynes was writing this, he was really only looking at this section down here. So remember, the context of when he's writing was sort of global recession. So you could, and arguably with a Keynesian approach, argue three equilibrium states. We could be here, as we mentioned, probably the most likely from Keynes's perspective, deflationary gap, equilibrium, gets stuck there. We could be pushing an inflationary gap, if demand does increase too much, or we might be at full employment for the Keynesian model. Key features then: recessionary gaps can persist over long periods of time. Increases in aggregate demand does not cause increases in price level. You can, on that horizontal section of the long-run aggregate supply curve, you can increase aggregate demand without there being an increase in prices. So you should be able to just play around, at this stage, you should now be able to play around with just simple aggregate supply, aggregate demand, look at these reasons why they might shift, and say whether it increases or decreases AS or AD. Depending on your question, sometimes you don't need to go into the classical Keynesian debate, so you would just draw the economy in a relatively simple way, because you're just trying to make a relatively simple point. These slides here just look at the inflationary and deflationary gaps and the implications. So look, an inflationary gap, that's the classical view. Short and aggregate supply will shift back. Deflationary gap, recessionary gap, here's the classical view that the short run aggregate supply just shift to the right. There's a lot of diagrams to familiarize yourself with. You should be able to draw these. This is a sort of classical diagram showing an inflationary gap. AD is shifted to the right. So depending on the question, this is the consequence of that from a classical perspective. Deflationary gap. Depending on the question, determines the type of diagram that you're going to draw. There's loads of them. That's a Keynesian diagram now because I can see the shape of the long run aggregate supply curve. So it's how Keynes would show a deflationary gap. Here's a Keynesian situation where there's a need to shift aggregate demand to the right, to get that increase in real GDP and to move the economy out of a depression. Inflationary gap in a Keynesian model. This is an interesting one. It's because it's basically saying, look, if you're a Keynesian, you believe the economy gets stuck here in a deflationary gap. If you focus on supply side now and just shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, it has no impact on the equilibrium level of output in the economy. Like it's ineffective. You're making the potential output increase, possibilities, but that in itself is not enough to stimulate the economy and get you out of that recession. You need the demand in order for that to happen. This is a classic diagram for supply-siders, shifting the long run aggregate supply to the right. Very attractive because you start here and you end up here, and by increasing the productive potential of the economy, you not only get an increase in real output and employment, but you also get a decrease in inflation. So you can achieve both of those objectives. That's the basic title of those particular diagrams. Right? So lots of diagrams, but gives you the fundamentals of Keynesian and the classical debate in this particular unit.